In this next module, we're going to introduce Angular to you. This will include installing Angular, using the Angular CLI or command line interface, integrating your Angular app with an ASP.NET Core project, using external templates, and creating components. Let's get started. Before we dive into Angular, let's talk a little bit about single-page applications. Angular is a typical way to build single-page applications, but let's talk about what that term actually means. This is typically a large app, often in the enterprise, that will encompass a lot of different functionality. It can be consumer-facing, though it's less common, and wants to replace web navigation. So instead of going to individual pages like we've seen with ASP.NET MVC, it actually stays on the same page and then changes the content as the user navigates around. It also wants to centralize different services in calling APIs, including the ones you've written in ASP.NET. So this asks a common question, and that is, should you just write SPAs for all your front ends? SPAs typically are overused in a lot of organizations. SPAs are great for doing forms over data, for allowing users to look at data, enter data, delete data, validate data. They really allow you to do that in some great ways. They're also very commonly used for dashboards when you want to be able to display different kinds of data and data visualization for users. Their ability to be long-lived and make requests to APIs for updates makes it a really common pattern there. What I've seen over the years is that forcing a SPA into a website is often really silly. Trying to think that you want your entire website to be one giant SPA just isn't that useful. Pragmatically, I often talk to people about creating islands of functionality, small parts of your web application that is a SPA. You could imagine something like a contact page being an Angular app, and then having your checkout page be an Angular app. But the idea of creating the entire website as one giant single-page application, I think, overcomplicates it. So let's talk about what Angular is. Angular is a successor to AngularJS, which was a very popular SPA framework several years ago. It's an open-source JavaScript framework. It was built by Google for its own projects, so it uses Angular internally for some of the tools it builds. The idea is that it wants to supply some basic app services. It wants to be able to handle things like writing components, creating services, dealing with dependency injection. And it's for creating these rich client-side applications. So think about this as code you're writing to live in a browser on a particular page, and that often is long-lived. One of the benefits here is that you can create interactions with your users that don't require you to go back to the server every time to update a page. When we talk about rich clients, we're really talking about single-page applications. Angular leverages TypeScript in most cases, though you can write it in Dart as well, and it was built with TypeScript at Google. Enough talking about it, let's get our hands dirty. Let's start by installing the Angular CLI. This is how we're going to create new projects and build our projects. So I'm in our project directory, the same directory that our project is sitting in. And what I want to do is first make sure that Node is installed. Visual Studio pre-installs Node, but you're going to need Node, more importantly, the Node Package Manager, in order to handle this. So if we do Node version, that will tell us that we have Node installed. If you don't have Node installed at this point, you can just open a browser and go to nodejs.org. You'll want to install either the long-term supported version or the current version. I always work with the current version because we're just using Node not to run our application, but to build our application. The need for long-term support version is much less important. I would go ahead and download and install the current version of Node. With that, we're going to see a tool called NPM, or Node Package Manager, that we're going to use to install the Angular CLI. We look at NPM version, we should be somewhere around the 7-point version. This will probably be after this version for you, but if you have a very old version of Node on your machine, you're going to want to upgrade it. To install the Angular CLI, we're going to use npm and tell it that we want to install @Angular, which is going to be the beginning part of all the Angular dependencies we're going to use, and it's just called CLI. Now we want to install this on the machine, not just in our folder, so we're going to add the -G, and that will add it so that we can call it from the command line. And once it's installed, we should be able to use a new command called ng and ask for its version. And we can see we're using the Angular CLI 11.2.2, though this is likely going to be a later version if you're using this course other than the day it dropped. Angular updates itself pretty quickly, and this is going to be the version I'm going to be using to build the examples here, though again, you may be using a later version. If we just type ng, we'll see that there's a number of commands that it supports. The ones we're going to care about are build and new. In both of those cases, one is going to create a new project for us, and then build is going to allow us to compile our application into a set of JavaScript files that we can use in our ASP.NET Core app. Let's create that new project next. So let's create our first Angular project. Back in the command line, we're going to see that ng-new is going to be a command we can use to create a new project. And so I'm just going to do --help here, just so we can see some of the option that it supplies. Now you can just do ng-new and then the name of the project we want, but we're going to use a couple of these flags to investigate how this actually works. So we're going to do ng-new, and then we're going to call it a new directory called client. And this will actually create a subdirectory under our Dutch Treat project called client. That'll be the build folder for your project. We're going to use a couple of these options. First, I'm going to say skip git, because I don't want it to build a git folder for us. This may be part of a larger project that we're including in Git, but we don't want it to pretend that this folder is a new Git repository. I'm also going to tell it to skip tests. Probably don't want to skip these in the larger picture, but I want us to start with a very minimal Angular project so you can see what all the moving pieces are. I'm also going to tell it that I want it to be the minimal version, the smallest amount of moving pieces. If we don't use minimal, it'll actually include a lot of boilerplate that we can use to learn how Angular works, and that normally would be perfect. But for us, we're going to start with, just like we did with ASP.NET Core, the smallest actual project, and there's actually an option called defaults that will just default everything to the default options. Last thing I'm going to put in here is dry run. And this last option tells it to show me what it's going to create, but don't create it yet. And so let's run this now. We can see what it's going to create is a new client folder with some configuration objects at the root, and then a number of files that are in our source code. And we'll investigate these in a minute. Let's get rid of dry run now that I'm confident that this is what I want it to build. And go ahead and let it create that client directory for us. It creates the files, and then it uses npm to install all the code that our project is going to depend on. Now that it's installed all the packages, we can go directly into the client folder, and we can see what's in that client folder. And there's a special folder if you haven't used Node before called Node Modules. And this is where all those dependencies that Angular needs are installed. If we go over to Visual Studio, we'll see that this new client directory is inside of our project. Because we created it, Visual Studio will know about it and automatically include it as part of our project. And we'll get to how this relates to the ASP.NET, the next module, but let's make sure everything's working. Back in the console, let's type ng build. This will take all that source code that we'll dig into soon, and it'll actually build it using the Angular CLI tool. And so we can see what it's built is a number of JavaScript files that we can use, including a CSS file. So vendor is the core part of an Angular app that is the library that our application is going to use. Polyfills are support for older browsers. Main.js is where our actual code is going to reside. And then runtime is for some runtime semantics that are included as well. And then styles are for any styles that are defined in the Angular app. We're going to actually include these all on a page pretty soon. But before we do that, let's try one more command, which is ng serve. Often people will build their Angular app outside of something like Node or ASP.NET. And so they just want a simple version of their app that is running in a browser. And so that's where ngServe comes in. It's going to do that same building, but in this case, it's going to actually expose a web page with our application. And if we go to that web page, we can see that this is the default Angular app as they built it. This is just a welcome to the name of the project, and then has some links and images that are included in that default project. Let's go back to Visual Studio and look at the structure of the Angular app to just give us a brief overview. So like I showed you before, there's a client directory, and when we build our client directory, it's actually going to create a directory under it called dist, which is for distribution, and then the actual client files. So you're going to see those same .js and .css files that we saw at build, and then it has an index.html, and this is what it's using to serve that file. We're actually going to serve it via a Razor view. We're not going to do it via just a plain old HTML file. But let's look at some of the other files that are going to be important. One is going to be tsconfig. You probably remember this from the last module where we had one at the root of our project. In our case, this is a tsconfig specifically for Angular. Angular has built this to have all the options that Angular needs. So for the most part, you're not going to want to touch this. There's also a package.json. And this is a file that contains all the dependencies that Angular needs, both development dependencies and runtime dependencies. This is the file that was built by the CLI to tell it what different packages it needs. And you can see that there's a number of different @Angular dependencies here. And lastly, there's an Angular JSON about how to configure your project. We're going to touch this a little, but for the most part, you're just going to leave it alone. And lastly, our actual code. This is where the main.ts is the starting point for our project. And this is a pretty small file. Essentially, it's going to run our project in the browser, and it's going to be looking for our project defined in something called the app module. So if we look at app, we'll see there's an app.module.ts file that was created. And this defines the startup module for our project. This is basically all the different components that need to be pulled in together to build our project. And one of the most important ones here is actually app component. What we're saying here is that we have some component that Angular is building for us that we're going to use as the first thing to show, the component to show as the main window, if you want to think about it in that way, for our Angular app. So let's look at that app component. We look at this app component, it's a TypeScript class, doesn't have a lot of data to it. The biggest part of what it has is actually this template. Now, if you can read the HTML here, you'll see that it looks a little familiar, right? This is the HTML that we saw showing when we did the serve. We're going to come and replace most of this code with an actual application to build some functionality into our Dutch Treat project. Now, I've shown you a lot of files, and there's a lot of maybe confusing pieces to this already. Hold on, take a deep breath. We're going to dive into them as we build our project one by one, and I think you'll start to get your head around it a little better. Let's start digging in and building our project next. So now let's integrate our project with ASP.NET Core. Before we can dig in, we're going to want to make our project here be able to be served by ASP.NET Core. And of course, this dist folder is not going to be available to Razor pages, right? Everything needs to be in this www root folder. And so what we're going to do is actually start by just opening up the Angular JSON. And there's a lot of JSON here for configuring your application. Let's ignore most of it, and let's come down here to inside our client project, because this can take more than one project. And we're going to skip all the schematics here, and we're going to look for architect build options. This is one of the only things we're going to need to change, and instead of the output path being dist client, which is what we saw here, right? Dist client, is we're going to change this to up one level, www root, and we'll leave it as client. And the change here is simply to build those same assets into a directory inside of our www root folder. That way we can use it. We're not going to touch much of the rest of this file. Later on, we may turn on some other things, but for the most part, that's the one change we need to do to make this work. And so what happens? What we're going to want to do is actually open up either the developer PowerShell here in Visual Studio, or we can do it at the console as well. Let's go back to the console. And if we do ng build, this will rebuild our project for us. But notice it's taking a minute to actually do it. We can see here the time of the build is 4.5 seconds. We could add this to our build step, but that's going to slow down our build every time. Instead, what we're going to want to do, and leaving one of these consoles open to do this, is ng build -- watch. And what this will do is this will build your project and then wait for changes and do a quick fix up and build when we make those changes. So you can see here, it took a little while. In fact, it took even longer because it's being set up for this watch, and it's just going to wait here. Back in Visual Studio, if we look at the www root folder, we have the client folder with all those same files that we saw before. So if we open up one of the source files, and let's go ahead and just look at that main.ts, and let's just add an extra space and save it, we'll actually see that it went, oh, look, something's changed. I'm going to rebuild this one file that needs to be built. 4 of the other chunks weren't changed, so we're going to leave it, and then it rebuilt it. And this time it took, 187 milliseconds, much, much faster. And so when you're dealing with Angular, this is the way you're going to build it. You're going to let it run and build using ng build in a separate terminal. Or alternatively, you can use the Developer PowerShell window in Visual Studio, though I don't tend to do that. And so as we make changes to our Angular app, it'll go ahead and keep it up as the latest version in every case. So now that we have it in the www root, we should be able to go ahead and add it to an existing page. Let's do that next. So let's use the Angular project we've been building in our actual ASP.NET project. Back in Visual Studio, let's go ahead and close this for now. And let's open up our views to that shop page we've been using. You remember in here, we've been using server side to build up the list of products for us. I'm just going to comment this out for now. And I'm just going to create a little element here called the shop. And notice I'm just creating an element that I'm sure the browser doesn't know what to do with. So it actually ends up treating it just as a div. But we're going to use the name of this shop to tell Angular where to put this in our page. In our case, this is going to be the entire shop.cshtml, but you might imagine that if you had other structures, like a Bootstrap container or something, this shop would go inside of that. We're also not going to use these scripts anymore, so I'm just going to get rid of them, because what we want to do here is actually include the scripts from client. Now remember, we're building this in the background because we ran ng build watch, and so we can continue to just let this run like we saw before. And that way we can start using these JavaScript rendered files. We're going to start with just vendor, and let's put vendor up there. Let's put polyfill second and runtime third. And those 3 aren't going to change a whole lot. Most of the code we write is going to be in this main.js. So because of this file might change a little, I'm actually going to tell ASP append version equals true. I'm going to tell it to throw in a version tag at the end to sort of break the cache in the browser, so that the URL for this script is going to be different every time. It's just going to put in a query string parameter, which we'll see in a minute for what that does. We also need to host this styles.css because there may be CSS that's embedded in our project that Angular has also built. But in order to do this, we actually have to make a small change. We open up our layout. If you remember, we have this render scripts down here for adding scripts to the page as we need them, just like we did here in the shop, right? We're going to want to do the same thing for styles. And so let's do @render section. Let's call it head, since it'll be anything we want to put in the head. That may not be just styles, but for us it's going to be styles. And then say false, because we don't want this to be required. With this render section in place, we can then create another one of these section head. And inside of there, we can go ahead and grab our CSS so that it's thrown into the correct part of the page. We could put it down here in our scripts, but I prefer CSS to be at the top of the page, and so that's where we get this. With these being imported, we should be able to go to the shop page and see it, but not quite yet. The only other thing we need to do is look at our actual Angular code. So here in our client, which is again is the source for it, I'm going to walk through this a little bit again. The main.ts is going to load up effectively the app module and tell it to display it on the page. And part of this app module, like we talked about earlier, is that it's going to include all the different libraries that are needed. And one of them that it's building is something called an app component. An app component is that first UI to show. So we showed you that app component earlier. There's really two properties here that are going to matter to us. There's template, which has the UI in it, and we have app root, which is the selector being where do I want to host this. So we're going to want to change this to actually the shop, and this is going to tie it back to the shop here. We're saying the selector for this is just an element called the shop. This could be a div with an ID of foo, right? And then our selector here might be a pound foo, right? Though the stylistically Angular usually uses their own element names for hosting that. The other thing we're going to do is we're just going to change our title here to Dutch Treat Shop. And what does this property inside of our TypeScript class really mean? If we go back and look at the template, we'll see that there are these double curly brace markers with our actual title in here. And this is how data binding works. Essentially, we're saying that this property on app component, we can insert into the HTML right here. And so if we run this again, we should see this in a couple of places. We can see it's in title here and it's in title here. Go ahead and save any changes we had, and then let's go ahead and run our site. So we're building the ASP.NET Core project, and then we'll go ahead and launch in the browser when we're done. And remember, this is just building all the C# code. We're using that extra terminal to build our Angular app. And so if we go over to shop, of course, we need to log in to get to the shop. So we're going to go ahead and log in, say, remember me, so we stay logged in. And here we're on our shop page, and we're now seeing that same component we saw before. But of course, our new title is being injected into the page for us in the simplest of data binding ways. Now that we have the Angular app hosting in our actual ASP.NET app, let's start making this work in the way we want it to work. Let's go ahead and change this markup to be the same markup that we want to use for the actual shop page. Let's get that started next. Next, we're going to start using external templates to separate the code in our Angular from the actual markup. Back in Visual Studio, let's get rid of all of the open tabs, and let's open up our app component.ts. That's the core of what we're actually building. And you can see we have this template that we've been talking about as that markup. Let's get rid of that template entirely, because we're going to replace it with code we want to write. And instead of template, let's change it to template URL. And this way, we can define the markup as a separate file, a little easier to manage, and we'll be able to actually get HTML highlighting instead of this embedded string nonsense. And so here, we're just going to give it the name of the URL. And in our case, it's going to be in the same folder, and we're going to call it app component, just like we did the regular component, but this time it's going to be HTML. Let's create that file. And when Angular builds this, it's going to actually embed this HTML into the project for us. We don't need to host these. It's much more a matter of just having a place to have our code. And let's start by creating an HTML snippet effectively. So we're going to start with a div, and let's give it a class of row. Again, we're using Bootstrap to do much of this. And then we'll have another div. And in this case, we'll use column 9 because we want the left-hand section to have 3/4 of the page. And then I'll do column 3 using those Zen coding extensions to just create that for me. And inside these, I'm just going to create an H1 tag, and I'm going to use that double curly brace to inject the title onto our page here. So that later in the TS component, in the TypeScript file, if I change this, it'll go ahead and just inject it. And let's do the same thing here with an H1, and let's call this our cart, which we will implement in a little bit. we go back over the terminal, we can see it's still building. If it has stopped building because of some of the things that you've done, sometimes it'll crash out if you've made some major changes to the project. Just run ng build watch again to keep it going. But in most cases, it won't change it unless we make some major changes to our project. So now that we have this, if we go ahead and refresh it, we should see our new design, right? Dutch tree and cart, and this is our new Angular app. Now, we didn't have to rebuild the server because we're not changing the server, we're just changing the client so far. I think that these are a little big, so let's go and make a quick change. Let's change these to H3s, right? We come back here and refresh, we can see it's made it small. We haven't had a rebuild process because we're having Angular behind the scenes rebuild this every time we make that change. Let's make one more change. We already have our page saying Dutch tree, so let's just change this to shop. Then when we refresh it, we're back to shop taking part of the page, cart taking part of the page, and we can start to actually implement our page using Angular. Let's do that next. So let's build our first Angular component and show you how that works. Back in Visual Studio, let's go back to our app folder. And let's create a new folder called Views, and then let's create a product list view. And we're going to name it .component.ts, just like we did for the app.component.ts and HTML. Now, what's interesting here is that we're essentially creating different views for our products to use, and we're using the naming so that we can see very easily that it is a component versus a module versus a service, those sorts of things. This isn't required. This is just convention. If you take other courses here at Pluralsight or you join a company that's already using Angular, this is very commonly how they'll name it. Not necessarily, you could just call it product list view as well, but to make it easier for you to use other courses here at Pluralsight, I'm going to follow this convention, even though, frankly, I kind of hate it. The fact that it makes the names of the files so long irritates me a little bit, to be honest with you, but it'll be good enough. So now that we have this, we're going to actually create a class called product list view. And again, this is a TypeScript class. And what are we going to want in it? We're going to want a public property called products. And this is just going to be an array of items. And we're going to actually instantiate it with a couple of demo objects so that we can actually use it. So I'm going to say Van Gogh or Van Gogh or Van Gogh, if you prefer. And I'm going to give it a price of $19.99. Let's make this a mug. And let me copy the same to the second one as Van Gogh poster. Let's make that one $29.99, right? And we're essentially just creating a class that exposes a property that has some data that we want to show on the screen. We're going to want to export this as the default object in our class. Now, why do we export it at all? We export it because when we are going to use this, we're going to want to include this in our module so that we can use it on a page. So let's go to App Module. And what we're going to want to do is include our product list view as a declaration that we can use on different pages. And we'll see how that works in a minute. And you notice what it did was it added an import. And if it didn't, you're going to need to type this out. But Visual Studio is usually pretty good about adding the import. And it's basically saying, go get the default thing that was exposed by this TS file in our case and name it this locally. Now, normally this is going to be the same name that's being used in the class, but it's not actually required. And so once we have the product list view here, we should be able to just use it inside of our page. But we don't have any markup. We don't have any data binding happening yet. And the reason for that is we actually have to use something called a decorator. Now, you may be more familiar with the concept as something like an attribute inside of C#. So it's the same idea that on our class, we're going to add something that's going to decorate it with some metadata. And so we're going to decorate it with a decorator called component. Now, if we hit Control period, we can actually tell it, oh, we want to import this component from Angular core. You may not remember that, but the IntelliSense will actually help you do that. And we can see in order to use this, we needed to import this just like we did before. And this is effectively the same sort of idea that using statements do at the top of C# files. We're essentially defining where this comes from, and this is part of Angular. And so what does component have in it? It has an instantiation object that has a couple of different things. But we do have template URL, just like we did before, right? And so what are we going to call it? Product list view component.html, just like we did before. So we're going to need to create this file, but we also are going to need a selector. This is going to be the name of the element that we're going to use and the markup in the HTML files of other components to use this component. And so for us, we'll just call it product list. So effectively anywhere in our application, because we've added it to the module, this will allow us to inject an instance of the product list view wherever we want it. So let's go ahead and create that product list view.component.html. Get rid of the markup that it included, and let's just go ahead and create a div. And I'm going to give it a class of a row, just so we have it sort of contained. And then I'm just going to use an unordered list here to show some list items. And what I want to do is I want to show each of those products that we have in our component. So remember, we have two products here in a property called products. So what we'd like to do is just repeat this li every time we have an individual component. We can do that with what are called directives, and these are attributes on elements that are specific to Angular. In our case, we're going to start with a star and say ng4. ng4 is going to allow us to have a JavaScript or TypeScript equation that says, how am I going to repeat this? So ng4 is going to say, let p of products. Effectively, it's going to go through the product list, assign a new variable called p that we can then just use data binding on. p.title should show us the title for each member of the products. Now we're going to add more products later and even use APIs, but this will be a simple way to say for every member of that list, this is how we're going to show them. And we're going to show them as a list item, but this could be a div, this could be all sorts of things. The important part is this thing called a ng4 directive that allows us to say we're going to repeat this item over and over and over again. So let's take our product list and let's include it on our HTML page for the component and just say product list. So we're just going to inject that product list here on the page. If we now refresh our page, we can see this is now working. Our two products are being shown here. Let's make one more change to show our price as well. So back in the component, let's go ahead and put our product name and then p.price as well, right? We're effectively saying inject these into string concatenation inside of our list items for each of these lines. Go ahead and refresh it. We can see those prices show up magically. And so we're a long way from having a completely valid Angular app for what we're trying to do, but we can start to see the pieces of how Angular is going to allow us to do this. We're going to want to take these basics we've learned and extend them to start to really create the markup and interactivity, more importantly, that we want to see in our Angular app. So I'm just scratching the surface and building a very minimal Angular app in this module and the next two modules. But there is a whole complete course of Angular called Getting Started, as well as one on the Angular CLI that you may want to look at as well. So what have we learned in this module? I've shown you how Angular can be used to create modular rich clients, or SPAs, for your applications. I've shown you how the data binding happens in the views or the HTML instead of the code, whether we're doing list binding or simple property binding. And I've shown you how to use Angular CLI that will help automate this build process. Up next, we're going to include services with Angular, so we're actually getting real data from the server.